The Super Turbo 28. This is a classic Amiga accelerator from back in the day. Supposedly a low-cost alternative to some of the other accelerators out there, and was sold for the Amiga 500 or 2000. This one is for the 500, as you can maybe tell by the image on the front of the box. It comes in a rather thin looking sidecar, and it claims to turn your Amiga into a 28 MHz speedster. The thing is though, this one doesn't seem to work. This belongs to Alan, another local Amiga enthusiast, and he dropped it off to me to see if there's anything we can do. So let's start with a bit of an unboxing. Let's have a look at everything that is in here, and then we'll plug it in and see what it does. But perhaps before we do just take it out of the box, let's take a closer look at what the sales blurb on the side of it says. So the Super Turbo 28 turns your Amiga 500 or 2000 into a 28 MHz speedster. Now you can run high performance programs without investing in high priced hardware. The A500 unit is completely external, just plug and play, no need to open the case and risk invalidating your warranty. A unique bus pass-through slot enables you to add external expansion units such as hard drives and RAM. The A2000 unit plugs in easily into the 86-pin coprocessor slot, and both versions are designed for compatibility with other Amiga add-in units. The Super 28 outpaces expensive accelerators, but if you need to slow down for games or older software, use the external on-off switch or the software speed control. The package contains detailed installation instructions and everything you need to increase your computer's performance from 7 to 28 MHz in record time. It then lists a couple of features of the accelerator itself, but the bit that I think is more interesting is this speed comparison chart. And I think this is making some very bold claims. So we have 3 tests and 5 different scenarios. The Super Turbo 28 itself, at the top there, with all the results in blue. That's the results in minutes, by the way. Then we have an unaccelerated A500 or 2000, a 68000 CPU at 14 MHz, an 030 CPU at 25, or an 030 CPU at 25 MHz with 2 MB of fast RAM. And the thing that I think is particularly interesting here is that this is claiming our Super Turbo 28 is performing almost as good as the 25 MHz 030 with the 2 MB of RAM. Yes, it is slightly behind that in each of these tests, but it is leagues ahead of all the others. The thing is though, as the blurb over here described, our Super Turbo 28 doesn't add any additional memory. And if you look at an example between the unaccelerated A500, so just the 68K running at 7 MHz, and say a 25 MHz 030, well, there is very little difference between those. And I would hazard to guess that there is little difference between those because in both of those scenarios there's no additional fast RAM. Now that doesn't really add up when you consider that middle test there, a 14 MHz 68K. Why would that be faster than 25 MHz 030? So yeah, I'm not overly trusting of these results here. But if we're going to test it for ourselves, well, we need to get it out of the box and need to get it working. So what all is in here? We have the accelerator itself, still in its bag. Is this new old stock? There's the manual and the disc associated with it. And that was stuck down there. This couldn't be brand new, could it? The disc, the warranty card, the manual, and attention GVP owners. Not that this affects us, I don't have any GVP stuff, but if you do have a GVP Series 2 hard drive or any other interface with hidden DMA, please read Chapter 5 before you start using your Super Turbo 28. The Super Turbo 28 will work properly with your hidden DMA device when you follow the instructions in Chapter 5. That just says exactly the same thing twice in 2 different sentences. So there obviously must have been some significant problems there, especially considering they put this on a bit of red paper. The manual itself is a little dog-eared just because it's been lying in that box for so many years. And yeah, we're not going to read through all of this at the minute, but we will keep it handy because there are a couple of jumpers inside this thing that we may need to set. The accelerator itself then, yeah, just sits in a rather thin looking sidecar. Obviously connects to our Amiga 500 there. And there seems to be a trapdoor on this. There is the pass-through, and there's some jumpers that we might need to amend. So yeah, how about we just plug it in and see what it does. There's the off-on switch, currently off. That might make it work better. And look at that. A position here for a 5-volt DC regulated supply, and a symbol there suggesting it's looking for a center positive supply, but no jack in there, nothing to plug said supply into. This is the 500 Plus that we were working with last time. We'll use this as our test bed today. Let's just quickly make sure that this still works. And yeah, that seems to be fine. So let's get the sidecar trapdoor off and let's get this installed. So this should just pull off and this should just slide in. Simple as that. But will it do anything? Black screen. Doesn't seem to be doing very much. Yeah, this is just as Alan described. It is doing nothing. If we try to turn it off at the back and try to power it up again at that, does that make any difference? Nope. Still not doing very much. The Amiga is not starting at all. In fact, one way to tell is looking at the power LED on the Amiga. If this machine was trying to start, if it's coming at a reset, the power LED should start dim, then go bright. And as we can see here, that just stays dim. If I turn off and quickly remove our accelerator, this time we should see the intensity of that power LED change. There it goes. So yeah, something is very much not happy when this is installed. I suppose the first thing to do would be to get that manual and just double check those jumpers. I took the top cover off this just to make it a bit easier to show you what I'm doing. Yes, that does disconnect the switch, which was connected there at the boot jumper, but testing that switch, it's actually in the open position when the card is enabled, so we can't just leave that off. That is this permanently enabled. But there are 2 other jumpers here, machine and option. So I had a quick flick through the manual, and there's nothing really about those until you get to Chapter 5, solving problems. Well, we have certainly got a problem, so let's see what it says. Setting the machine jumper. If your Amiga does not seem to function at all with the Super Turbo 28 installed, Super Turbo 28 may be set wrong for the machine type. The machine jumper must be set as follows for proper operation. If using an A500, well, that's us. The machine jumper must be removed. And if we take a look at this, the machine jumper, that is that one in the middle, and that is open. So yeah, that is removed. So that is definitely set right. That other jumper then, the option jumper, well, the only reference that I can find to that is in this section, which deals with bridge boards. And essentially removing that option jumper, so disabling that, stops this thing from caching the upper 4 megabytes of Z2 RAM. You can have 8 megabytes total of 02, and this thing is designed to cache all 8 megabytes. And it is within that, in essence, where this thing gets its speed from. But the reason for that option jumper, well, that sort of explains how this card actually works. So this section describes a situation where you would have a bridge board that has onboard memory that is shared between the bridge board's processor and the Amiga. Now, I've never used one of those, but from what I'm reading here, I would assume that any such memory on one of those bridge boards must be in that upper 0 to 4 megabytes range. And the reason for disabling that section of memory from being cached is that if the CPU on the bridge board were to change the contents of that memory rather than the CPU on this change the contents of it, well, this thing would be unaware of it and the contents of the cache here would be incorrect. And so it seems that's where this gets its speed from. This is caching fast RAM, but because there's no fast RAM actually on this, it's relying on external fast RAM. Well, if you only had this on its own, well, the only benefit you're going to get out of this card is 28 megahertz clock, which by itself, if we go back to the test results on its own box, well, a higher clock alone with no additional memory doesn't necessarily equal that much of a performance boost. This cannot cache chip RAM for the same reason that it couldn't cache RAM on a bridge board. That chip RAM is accessible by the rest of the system. It can write to it. That is all managed by Agnes outside of the control of the CPU. And so the cache on here has no real means of keeping track what is in that chip RAM at any given time. Plus, aside from that, to access the chip RAM, this card would need to slow down to 7 megahertz anyway, because that's the speed that's running at. Whereas this, and I would assume any fast RAM that you attach to the system with this attached is running at 28 megahertz. But back to the question of why does this not work? Well, all the jumpers seem to be set correctly. I suppose the first thing we should try is a bit of contact cleaner, just in there, and on the edge connector on the 500 itself. I suppose it is a little dirty in here. It's one thing we didn't do last time. Try to give this a clean, because, well, I wasn't using this last time. But let's see if that makes any difference now. So, power on. Yeah, it was never going to be that simple, was it? Power LED is still dim, still just a black screen. It just doesn't seem to work, does it? So I think the best thing to do is just to remove it from what's left of the plastic here. And then we'll see what we can do to fix it. Okay, let's try and fix this accelerator. Hey, what are you doing? I'm trying to fix this. Did you not watch the last video? Put the Dremel away. He got that Dremel out again? Yes, he's screwing about with this Dremel again. Put the Dremel away. Do you need me to come in there and speak to him? No, it's okay, I got it. Listen guys, I know what I'm doing. You don't know what you're doing? Right, well okay, if you need me, just shout. Just put it down. Well, what do you suggest to do then? I don't know. Why don't you get your microscope out and take a closer look at it with that? I suppose that's probably not a bad idea. So let's take a look at this using this. And I recently discovered while trying to charge this that if I plug the USB cable into the PC, it streams video across that and I can capture said video in OBS. So let's see how this works. It obviously isn't the highest resolution thing, but it does provide a pretty good zoomed in picture, and I'm probably a good 10 inches there away from the surface of this. I can bring that way down in. Now we can get very up close and personal with the soldering. And that is really the reason that I have this out here, because I want to go around this thing and double check that there are no cracked solder joints anywhere. But while we're at it, let's just have a general sort of overview of the card. So starting up in this top left hand corner at IC1, that is our crystal oscillator. And hopefully you can just about make that out. 28.3220 megahertz. So that is one thing we can check. In fact, we can check that with the oscilloscope, because our Amiga is producing a black screen. That would suggest that you've no CPU. It's not running any code. So could be a bad clock. We then have three components here with labels on them. These two, I can just about see an eye on the surface of the package there. So I would assume they are Intel parts. There you can see that eye there. But I'll have to remove those labels to better see what they are. Now, as you know, it's not my accelerator, but I have been speaking to Alan, who owns it, and he has given me permission to remove these. So let's try and do it nice and carefully with my knife. If we can just get that in under the corner of it, I should be able just to slide that off. Yeah. Then after just a quick clean with a little bit of IPA and cotton bud, we can see that the first one here down at IC2, that is a PAL. These other two then at IC11 and IC10, well, it's definitely an Intel part, and it's an N85C090. Yeah, they are both the same, but what is that? Well, looking up the datasheet for it, it is a CMOS PLD, or programmable logic device, sort of like another larger PAL or GAL maybe, or maybe even a bit like a CPLD. But that might spell bad news for us, because if there is a problem in either that one, or indeed that PAL, that most likely will spell game over. Moving on though, we have two components here on which the label has been sanded off. Why manufacturers do this, I have no idea. I mean, why would you ever do it other than trying to hide something? So I have no idea what they are. Initial guess, are they our cache RAM? Well, maybe not, because there are two chips at the far end of the board with labels on them that look like they're RAM, but we'll get to that. Beside these two though, we do have one more large package, again with the top sanded off, so with no real way of knowing what it is. Although I say that, I mean, it's pretty obvious what it is, isn't it? This must be the 68K processor. So yeah, why would you sand the top off the processor on your accelerator card? Well, one guess would be that you're running said processor at 28 megahertz, but this is not a 28 megahertz part. So could that be a failure point on this? I mean, why else would you ever sand the top off it? What else are you trying to hide? Is this 10, 12, 16, whatever megahertz part that is being overclocked, and might it have died? Equally though, by that logic, what are those? It would make you think whatever those are, they are being pushed beyond their spec as well. So maybe one of them, or both of them, or maybe all three of these components have failed. And then the other two chips at the end, which I can't find an awful lot about online from a Google search, but a TE9248NMS64X8AM25. I mean, at a guess, 64X8, 64K times 8-bit. That doesn't really make sense though, does it? Because this thing, our Super Corp 68K accelerator, this is only meant to have 16K of RAM on it. I think, yeah, 16K of onboard cache RAM. Although if those two are the cache RAM, what are those two? We then have a couple of tantalums, so I suppose we could check those with the multimeter, but I don't really expect them to be shorted or anything. I mean, they don't look like they're damaged in any way. One little resistor there. There's our jumper blocks. A little ceramic cap. And on the other side it is just an array of little passives. But nothing really to note. Nothing that looks as if it has blown up. I mean, I suppose we can test all those ceramics with the likes of the multimeter just to be sure that nothing is shorted. The connector itself coming from the 500 to this board, well, I mean, it all looks pretty straightforward, even if the soldering on it maybe leaves a little bit to be desired. Look at that there. There's a pin there that doesn't look like it has a lot of solder around it. Although it doesn't seem to move, it does seem to be attached. Can't get the knife down in behind it there, for example. That one looks the same. But again, I can't really get the knife in there, so it must be soldered up okay. So I've got our little scope out. Let's test that clock. I need to pick up a ground for the probe though. Pins 1 through 4 on the A500 sidecar connector, they are all ground. So I think we can just stick that on there like that, and that should be okay. Still just powers up to a black screen, but is there any clock coming out of this? And yeah, definitely something going on there. And there it is, 28.5 megahertz. Yeah, it was meant to be 28.3 something, wasn't it? But we'll allow that within the margin of error for this little thing. But assuming that this large package here is indeed the CPU, I mean, what else would it be? Is that clock signal making its way over to here? The clock should be present on this on pin 15, I believe, which is that one. And yeah, there it is, 28.5 megahertz. Out of interest though, if I turn that off and if we disable this card by closing the boot jumper, I think what that's going to do is feed 7 megahertz into this chip instead. And yeah, there it is. There is our 7 megahertz clock. And as I suspected, when you have your Super Turbo 28 disabled, what you are in fact doing is just slowing it down to 7 megahertz. With this installed, the 68K on the motherboard, that is disabled permanently. And this is your CPU. But that doesn't really answer why it's not working, does it? Because certainly getting the clock okay. It must be getting power okay, or you know, we wouldn't see that. I suppose we can check the other obvious, couldn't we? We could check reset, that would be on pin 20 of this chip. So reset, yeah, that's fine. Power on, stays low for a split second, jumps high. Active low signal, that's working as you would expect. So we've got a clock, we've got a reset, we've obviously got power here, but we have no signs of life. I was having a quick probe around some of these chips here just to see if there's any activity, and there is pretty much nothing happening here at all. Certainly not on those two. There is a little bit of activity around the PAL. I dare say it is maybe dealing with clocks, but these two, there is nothing happening on them. Equally, those two, there's not a lot happening. But one thing I have noticed in the sort of 10 minutes that it has been up and running, there is a nice little bit of heat in those two components. The CPU has a little bit of warmth in it. Those two RAM chips, they are stone cold. But those three, they are toasty. In particular, those two and this one on the right. It is starting to cool down now, but at its worst, I could hardly touch it. So possibly a failure in there somewhere. If that failure is in that thing, I'm sorry to say, but it's game over. Wonder if we could figure out what those are. Well, check this out. SuperCorp may have scrubbed off the writing on the two components here on this card, but it doesn't seem that they were that thorough on all their cards, because over on the Big Book of Amiga Hardware website, there is a high resolution image of this board on there, and on that image we can see what they are. They are 71B74s, which according to Google are 8K 8-bit chips. So is that the cache? And if that's the cache, then what are they? Although there's a reference to them being cache tag RAM. So is this the tag RAM and that's the actual cache itself? So could that mean that this card has 16K of tag RAM? Could that tag RAM be caching your 8 megabytes of 02 fast, and then you have a further 16K of onboard cache on this? If that is indeed the case, well, that would allow this thing to give you a slight speed boost on its own then, so long as whatever software you're running can be held within that 16K of onboard cache. But that all must be getting managed here by these two PLDs, because the 68K itself, to the best of my knowledge anyway, does not support cache RAM. So definitely a super interesting little board. I only wish that we could get it working. I mean, I do have a couple of spare 68K processors, so I mean, we could try swapping that out. I don't know if I've got anything with suitable replacements for those, because those two were getting quite hot, that one on the right in particular, which might signify a failure in it. But then again, equally, that PLD there was getting incredibly hot, so if that's the source of the failure, well, as I've said before, it's game over. Let me see if I can find anything that we could possibly use to replace those. I think I might have spotted the problem. As you maybe know, I edit these videos as I go, so everything you've seen up to this point has already been edited, that's all finished. But while putting the overlay for the two PLDs on the screen, I noticed that pin 2 of these should have a clock on it. And if we take a look at this one here, a position IC10, well, pin 2 does indeed have a clock on it. It's got that 28.5 megahertz clock, so that's fine. But if we look at the same pin on IC11, well, that is just being held high. At more or less VCC, it's sitting at 4.6 volts. So I've been able to figure out that the clock pin of IC10 is connected down to this PAL down here. The clock pin of IC11 is connected to the PAL on its right hand side at that pin. But that clock pin also seems to have a connection to VCC, and that is a dead short. So surely that cannot be correct. Well, yeah, seems I've done my usual trick. I've done a bit of a dumb, and it might just be the case that that clock pin is meant to be tied to VCC. Yes, there is a connection there between that clock pin and that pin on that PAL. Well, of course there is, because that pin I was measuring to on that PAL is the VCC supply pin for that chip. With that off the board, we can see that pin 2 there just runs to a via. And if we flip this over, you can see that said via goes absolutely nowhere. So it must be connected to one of the internal layers. This is a 4-layer board. You'd have to assume those two internal layers are either ground or VCC. So yeah, that must be correct. And in fact, there are 2 clock pins on these chips. And the second clock pin of this one, which is on this side, on pin 24, I think, it is connected directly to ground. The second clock pin of this one, IC11, is connected to our PAL up there, and there is indeed a clock on that, 3.52 megahertz. So yeah, that seems to be fine. Those two PLDs are rated for 50 megahertz, by the way, so no issues from that point of view. I can't really see those having burned out. And in fact, some people with their Super Turbo 28, they've been able to overclock it to say 40 megahertz, which shouldn't give you an issue with those things, might just give you an issue with that. There's a little bit of heat coming into that now. That one is quite warm, but then again, that one is running considerably faster, isn't it? It's running at a clock of 28 megahertz. That one's only running at 3. So I suppose this one here will generate more heat. Still quite concerned about the amount of heat that is in that diagram chip in particular. That is scary hot. And I've had a look through all my spare boards and things, and I cannot find a suitable replacement. I have ordered 2 of them from AliExpress, but it's going to be a few weeks before they arrive. Even if when they do arrive, if they're real. You know how that lottery tends to go when ordering chips from said website. But to finish off our experiments for today, shall we pull the CPU and test it? And I suppose one theory for why it might be the CPU at fault here is because there is no activity, nothing whatsoever on any of the buses. Nothing happening on the data bus, nothing happening on the address bus, nothing happening anywhere. And you'd expect all that to be driven by the CPU, certainly initially anyway. Plus, I suppose if it was a cache RAM fault, and if it was a RAM fault, surely to goodness this thing would still show some signs of life. You know, some of the memory cells within these were corrupted. Yeah, it's not going to work right, but surely you should still see something. That's a bit of a tongue twister. But surely you should still see something going on, you know, some activity. There is nothing happening whatsoever. So I can use this thing to test it with. Remember this, the 14 megahertz, 1 megabyte of Ranger RAM accelerator. This uses a PLCC type 68000. So let's just be sure first of all that this still works. And yeah, that looks fine. The Amiga has booted up there, no issue whatsoever. So let's swap over to this one. Quite a tight fit in there, just because, you know, that was soldered on previously. So there's a bit of solder on the legs of it. That's why it's not sitting perfectly flush, but I think it's making good enough connection. I've never seen a dead 68000 CPU. And it seems I still haven't, because that's booting fine. No issues there. So yeah, not the CPU. So unfortunately, I think that's pretty much all we can do today. I have just reassembled this just to keep it all together, but it doesn't seem to work, does it? Absolutely no signs of life in there. And for now anyway, I can't really think of anything else to test. Now, I know someone might think, does the 01 slot on the side of the A500 Plus, does that even work? Well, no CPU in the Amiga, rather a 68K on this A2000 CPU card plugged into this breakout board. And it works fine. Or someone might be thinking, what happens if you plug this in and use diagram? Well, that's my diagram for the Amiga 500, but with that in there and the Super Turbo 28, it still does nothing. So yeah, nothing wrong with the Amiga. Has to be something wrong with this. I suppose the only thing we have been able to prove today is that it's not the CPU. I don't think that PAL is at fault, because I do think it's dealing with the clocks, and we are getting clock signals to the CPU and to those two PLDs. Could be a fault in those PLDs themselves, you know. Other than that clock signal being fed into them, there is no other signs of life beyond the fact that there's a bit of heat in them. But the other suspicious thing in here is those two cache tag RAM chips. So yep, replacements for them are in the post, but it is going to be a couple of weeks. So we will come back to this once they arrive, and we'll try swapping them out, and you never know, it might just magically spring back to life. Or if there's anything else that any of you lot can think of that I should try, please get in touch and let me know. because I do really want to get this working. I think it would be really cool to try and benchmark this just to see how well it actually does perform. So yeah, that will have to do us for now. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next time we're in looking at this. As I said, if you've got any ideas of anything else to try, please let me know. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.